This is TwoGether, an Ada Bible Church podcast about the world of marriage, where we attempt to invite you to explore the ways marriage works and doesn't work. From practical ways of learning to biblical inspiration, we invite you to listen to other professionals and couples to help enrich your marriage. Here are your hosts, Rachel Norton and Samuel Jones.
Hey listeners, welcome back to TwoGether. It is an amazing day here in Michigan because guess what, Rachel?
What?
It is season 4, the very first episode of the season. And listen, we have so many great things prepared for our listeners this season. And I know I would tell all of my friends, all of our family members, every single individual that knows they're passionate about the area of marriage to listen to this season because we have some heavy hitters, Rachel. How excited are you about season 4?
You know, I'm really excited. I thought season 3 flew.
Yeah.
When I was first invited into this space to co-host with you and Kelly, I thought, well, this sounds like it'll be a neat adventure. But I've just had a blast. Even, hanging out with you guys more, each of the guests we got to have on, I was personally encouraged by each couple, each guest, and the content. So more and more people are finding out about this content and this podcast, and it's just been awesome to see the response.
Listen, I was looking at just some of the stats the other day and was so honored to see that, so many people have listened to this podcast. It's still being unveiled to some oh, wait a minute, our church, Ada Bible, has a podcast. But then when you look at just all the individuals from state to state, even other countries who are listening to this podcast, you can tell that people are taking away something and they're telling others. So super excited about what God is doing in the place and space of marriage, Rachel. But when we think about just season 3 a second, there were some really overlaid topics that really impacted people, from areas of redemption to blended families. What was maybe one of your favorite episodes or guests that appeared on the season on season 3?
Yeah, we definitely touched on that theme of redemption. The hunters inviting us into their story. Yeah. Where everything fell apart and how God just pieced their marriage back together. And now how they are investing in so many couples. I loved having Mike and Kim Ballin from Ada Bible. They've taken, what did they say, 50 couples under their wing and helped them get off to a strong start. It's that's be the church kind of stuff. And just, we love that.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of my favorite couples from last season was the Milton family. The Milton family literally has 5 teenagers that they're trying to figure out how to raise and launch into being great young adults. And then they had a baby because they started over again. And so just to hear their story and testimony, to raise 5 teenagers, if I had hair, which our our audio listeners can't see that I don't have hair, but literally if I had hair, I would be pulling it out. So,
yes.
That's definitely that. But I definitely love them. And again, the Hunter family, talking about marriage and sex and all those aspects was so amazing. Even the counselors we had on were amazing for season 3. And so I think that just prepped us for what God was going to do, is going to do in season 4. And so, I think that's a great just kind of, space to kind of introduce our next guest.
Yeah, I am excited to get to introduce Jeff and Shaunti Feldhahn. I first heard about you when we were at a conference in Orlando, and they welcomed you, Shaunti, onto the big stage. And you hadn't been scheduled there, but you hosted a breakout that had such a phenomenal response that everybody wanted to hear a little bit of the message you brought there. And I know you and Jeff had just teamed up in that message coming together. So we just want to welcome you. Thanks for helping us kick off season 4. Let's begin by just learning a little bit about yourselves, you, Shaunti and Jeff, and a little bit about your marriage.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Sam and Rachel.
Absolutely.
So why don't you start with Give me a little bit about us.
So we've been married 27 years, which still, I'm like, how did that happen? That's amazing. We are about to be empty nesters because we have a daughter in college and a son who's graduating high school shortly. And that's also a weird thing. We are definitely like, how did that happen? We're social researchers and have been for the last 18 years or so. We have worked really hard to try to put some analytical background that we have into work to help relationships.
What I could add to this is that we actually met bumping into one another on a corner of Harvard Square.
Wow.
Physically
bumping into each other.
That's how we met.
And from there, we, a longer story, but we connected in an a cappella singing group in graduate school.
Wow.
Unexpected.
I was in law school there at Harvard, and Shaunti was in working on her master's there at the Kennedy School and Harvard Business School, kind of a joint degree type thing. And from there, we moved to New York and had no idea that we were going to take the path that we've taken at this. And we describe ourselves as the semi-confused husband and wife that stumbled on these things, and we simply used kind of the analytical training to try to dig out the little things that people just don't understand about one another.
Sure.
That make a big difference once we do understand them.
Wow. And you imagine if you hadn't been in that square that day.
Exactly.
I know.
Do you love these stories God writes and all that he's has in store for you and through you too as a couple? Now, I learned something about you is that after you've been married for, I think it was 22 years, and you had done 13 years of this research you were talking about, that you wrote a book called Thriving in Love and Money. And I wonder, you talked about money before then as a couple. How did that go before you wrote this book? And then how did writing this book impact that conversation that you've had as a couple?
Well, the interesting thing is we'd done all this research on relationships, the differences between men and women, trying to help men and women understand one another.
And all sorts of other marriage topics.
And this was the one topic that we actually weren't on the same page about. And when you say that we talked about money, we primarily talked at each other about money. I wouldn't say that they were necessarily productive conversations. So when we approached this topic, we approached it with fear and trembling.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll be honest about what happened. We've been doing these studies for years, and we get a call from this financial services company called Thrivent. And some of your clients, your listeners may be familiar with them. We had not been familiar with them, but they try to do missional type stuff, and they called and basically said, look, money is a big issue in marriage, and we don't think it has to be. How would you feel about making this your next research project and us sponsoring some of it? And we were like, we had been praying, Lord, what's our next project supposed to be? And how are we going to pay for it? Like literally, this was this huge answer to prayer. And I went running into the kitchen. I'm like, Jeff, guess what just happened? And we're like, oh my gosh. And then about 30 seconds later, it was, oh my gosh, because that means that we're going to have to actually deal with this for the first time in the relationship side of things. Yeah. Because what this project was about, it had nothing to do with the technical stuff. It had nothing to do with budgeting and spreadsheets and getting out of debt. It was, how do you have a great relationship around money? So we knew that this was going to be a very personal project for us.
And just to be clear, you really don't want us advising you on the technical aspect of budgets and stuff like that. Just because, but now we know that we can do it without creating all sorts of anxiety and turmoil in our relationship.
Well, and maybe I'll speak into this later, but I think when we chatted with you before, Shaunti, you said, covering some of this ground is really important so that we can embrace the practicals in a meaningful way. But you two mentioned that you've written books and you've spoken at conferences. I just want our listeners to know a little bit more about you. This research that you've been involved with, I believe you shared that you've invested about $850,000 in research over the years. Mm-hmm. You've spoken at 1,000+ events. You have sold over 3 million books. I bet you never imagined God had all that in mind.
No,
none.
It's just astounding to see what God has done. It's amazing.
And what I will say that one of Shaunti's great gifts, and I came on as a partner with this, as mostly a silent partner at the beginning, just trying to help her kind of understand some of the research and the questions and trying to help shape and frame that. But her talent really is taking complex information and making it understandable and bite-sized for the average person like myself, who honestly, I just didn't know how to talk about a lot of these things because I honestly didn't know how I was feeling about things. And until you have words to describe things, conversation is really, really hard.
Everybody says, just communicate. Well, what we found is that often you need to know some of this stuff before you know what to communicate about.
Yeah, where do we begin, right? People ask.
Exactly. Now, your book, Thriving in, Love and Money, the money side of this, right? Money side of this conversation, kind of just based on your research, what was maybe your avoidance, your own avoidance of money conversations? And was that like atypical for what you kind of saw in your own research?
Yeah.
Well, no, it wasn't atypical. It was very typical. Here's the statistics that we found is that in reality, only 23% of couples can talk about money well without avoiding it, without having kind of the anxiety and the awkwardness and difficulty. 77% of couples just can't talk about money very well. And the interesting part is many of us think we're better at it than we are. Like on our survey, now these are big nationally representative surveys, right? That's why we spend so much money to try to get the good, rigorous data.
That's demographically
representative
around the United States.
Of age, racial background, religious background, geography, like all that kind of stuff. But what we found is that most people say, "Oh yeah, my spouse and I, we talk about money, just fine." That's kind of the standard initial framework that people think of themselves. And then later in the survey, we noticed that those same people,
sure,
say, "Oh, but we keep separate bank accounts because every time we try to merge our bank accounts, we start fighting." So
guilty as charged. Guilty as charged.
So that's like, okay, so that's not really somebody who communicates well. You're avoiding it. That's actually what's happening. And that's where we found that in reality, once you account for all those factors, in reality, 77% of couples, just avoid it or just don't talk about money well.
Wow. What's so amazing is that literally I was on the plane the other day and I was reading through your book, and the first 79 pages, I don't know if I was supposed to do this or not, but I felt like a strong spirit of conviction over just reading, what I was reading. And I was like, well, God, I see that you're wanting to deal with me and my spouse, specifically me. So, it definitely has some great, great information and just it helped me.
Every one of these research projects has had a high level of conviction for both of us.
Definitely.
And every now and then, I'll just tell you a little behind the scenes. And every now and then, because, we're, like I said, we're not psychologists. We're not marriage therapists. We have no idea what we're doing half the time. But we've learned these things and we try to apply them. But we're still like guinea pig number one. And every now and then, like we'll be out to dinner with another couple and I'll be like, I don't know, squabbling with Jeff or something. And the other wife will go, Shaunti, there's this book you need to read. I'm like, stop it. We need it too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I dipped into the book as well. And I was one of those that would say, oh, we're great. Like, we're tracking beautifully, but you have some kind of assessments in there. And I thought, oh, wow, there's some growth areas. So anybody, even if you're strong, I think can grow from stepping into what you share. So you've discovered something in your research. What would you say is the number one fact couples need to know to decrease the tension that they experience around money and talking about it?
So do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah,
on
do
this
that.
One? The most important starting point is kind of what we say is the summary of the book. So this whole 3-year research project really boils down to one sentence, which is, if you're having tension about money, the key is to know that it's not about the money. It turns out it's about how money makes you feel and how it makes your spouse feel. And it's about this host of expectations running under the surface about how money should work, and all of these, insecurities and worries and beliefs, maybe from childhood and how you grew up and how your family handled money. There's all this stuff running under the surface
that we don't necessarily recognize.
Correct. That we don't necessarily recognize. And that is what is the cause of the tension or the avoidance or the whatever that people tend to have around money.
I will, in just telling on myself here, when Shaunti and I, like I say, we did not effectively talk about money for the first 20 some years of our marriage. We avoided it. And one of the thoughts that would run through my mind, though I didn't say it out loud, was when Shaunti would make a choice that involved money in some way.
Because we're more like, he's the saver, I'm the spender.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yep.
And in my mind, I would say to myself, she just has a character flaw, I guess. And I'll just have to deal with it and live with it. And it's my, burden
Cross to bear.
Exactly. And that was because it felt so natural. What I was feeling and thinking felt like a law of gravity.
Sure.
It's you can't change it. It just is. And I had no idea that she had similar ones that felt
like laws of gravity to me, that were just different.
So true. Well, you kind of spoke about that when you write about the 5 key factors that impact couples when it comes to money.
Yeah.
I think you spoke into that already, just kind of talking about different values or, one spender, one saver. Tell us about these 5 factors.
So here's really if you boil down the results of what we found that matters, that we found in the research, it is these 5 things that we don't understand that are running under the surface. And the first one of them, which is actually related to most of the day-to-day friction that tends to happen around money, it's often at play, is that we don't understand that we're not valuing what our spouse is valuing. We don't kind of recognize that this human being that I'm married to, I know he's a different person, but it somehow it doesn't translate into, so he will therefore care about something different than I do. And oh, by the way, that is totally legitimate. That is just as legitimate as what I care about. That is usually the disconnect.
And the amazing thing is, even as I hear Shaunti saying that, it seems so obvious. Of course, we all know that. In the moment, we don't know that.
Maybe we should give him an example.
Sure.
Okay, so this is just an example of silly little stuff that happens every day in most of our marriages, but it's like the silly stuff that really matters, right? And so an example of this is, suppose that I am driving home from a long day of meetings and I call Jeff and I'm like, I'm just going to stop and pick up Chinese food on the way home because, that way we don't have to bother with dinner. And he goes, well, go ahead.
I've got some chicken breast from Costco that I can put on the grill, and we'll do that, and cook up, some frozen vegetables or whatever, and we'll do that, and I'll do it. I'm fine with being the one doing the cooking.
So he says that. Why does that bug me?
And
Yeah,
why
does it bug you, Shaunti?
and why does it bug
Jeff's
me?
like cha-ching, cha-ching.
You're right.
So here's what's going on in terms of not valuing what the other person is valuing and not even knowing what's going on under the surface in what it is that I'm valuing. Here's what we finally realized as we were in the middle of this research project. To me, I am thinking, and what I'm valuing without putting that terminology to it, but what I'm thinking is, we have been so busy and we've been running around with the kids, and our daughter is in college, and, she was home for just a little bit, and our son is doing track and he has all this thing. We haven't had any family time really in weeks. We've been going at cross purposes. And so to me, if we grill the chicken, well, that means that there's going to be preparation, and then the cooking time, and then the cleanup time, and then we have to start homework. And I'm basically $35 for Chinese food to buy this precious hour of family time. Of course, it's not even a question. Of course. But for Jeff,
I'm thinking, if we do all of these unplanned dinners that cost us $35, we're going to get to retirement and be homeless.
Hear you.
That's a leap, Jeff.
Easily, but it's there in my head.
Right.
Right, we get it.
But
Yeah.
both of these things are just, he values the sort of the security of saying, we're saving our money, we're being super careful, whatever. We've got all this, the COVID has had this impact on our family business and our family ministry. And I can
come up with dozens and dozens of scriptural references.
Oh, friends.
Right on.
Well, actually, that's actually a really good. Do you mind if I mention one other piece of this?
Please.
Awesome.
Because that is actually what's underneath a lot of these sort of value differences that we don't realize that's what they are. Mm-hmm. Is that one of the biggest different types of values is the spender saver. Now that applies to most couples actually, because even when you have two savers, one of them is usually a little more comfortable than the other with spending money. And so that dynamic is in most couples, it turns out. And by the way, let me just set to rest. There's a stereotype that the man is the saver, the woman is a spender. That is not actually statistically true. It was basically half and half. Mm. And so
good to know.
It's good to know. Yes, that's a stereotype that is not accurate. And so, but that dynamic exists in most couples. And what we don't sort of recognize is that in the church, and I'm going to do you mind if I step on a couple of toes here?
Step on them.
Okay. I'm going to step on a toe or two of the people who are listening, because I can imagine there are some people who are listening to this edition of the podcast because they are the money person, right? Mm-hmm. They are the saver. They are the person who goes to the stewardship classes, and they're married to someone who thinks differently than they do about certain things and maybe is more comfortable with spending. And what we found statistically, and what we found in all of our interviews and surveys, is that the person who is, if you're a follower of Christ and you are the saver type, as Jeff said, you come up with all those scriptures. Clearly, this is the biblical way of handling money. Nobody would build the tower, without making sure that you have enough money to complete it. You would never go to war without making sure that you have the resources to finish the battle. And you can list all of those. But here's the reality, is that the person who's more of the spender oriented can also come up with all the scriptures, who's like, well, but what about Jesus saying, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow's enough trouble of its own. Sure. What about God has good gifts for his children? What about the guy who's, saved all of his money up in barns and then never got to enjoy it? And so the reality is we can both come up with biblical basis for what we're thinking and feeling. And it means for us to recognize it's not that the other person is wrong and I'm right. It is truly that we are just different. And therefore, God wants us to come together as a marriage to honor one another and what each other values. And, the exception to that, because I know what some people are thinking, well, what about the person who has a gambling addiction?
Or a shopping addiction.
Or, whatever. Well, okay, let's say that if if that was the case, if you have 100 objective observers, 100 objective observers would look at the person with the gambling addiction or the shopping addiction and say that is objectively a problem, right? But if you have 100 objective observers looking at Jeff and Shaunti arguing about the Chinese food, you're not going to say this is objectively right and this is objectively wrong, right? Like that's just, it truly is, we're just different. And there is a really important piece of this puzzle that allows you to come together more in your marriage once you recognize that.
That is so good. You know, in my counseling brain, I literally think about two people who are married having this conversation and trying to figure out, like, why do you think this way about money? In a lot of cases, what I hear you all talking about is this journey of empathy and saying, you know what, I need to learn how to respect what you're saying because you have a differing value than I have. But at the same time, that differing value is a place that, it's based off of your experience. It's based off of, your thought process about the Word of God. It's based off of your thought process about how your family raised you. And so, like, hearing you all share that just gives me so much more light in regards to how couples can really get into that space of talking about this.
To sum it up in one word, it's humility.
Yeah.
It is, I may not be exactly right all the time. I may not be. There may be another way of looking at this thing.
Well, I mean, the reality, honestly, that I think will help a lot of marriages is no matter which direction you're coming from, right? If you have the feeling like I just have to, talk my spouse into realizing that I'm right, not that you would necessarily put it that way, but, clearly that's kind of what we're thinking subconsciously, you will never make progress. Like one of the things that we've done just dozens and dozens of radio programs on this topic with the money call-in talk shows, right? Like where somebody will have us on, tell us what you found about relationships. And all of the hosts, 100% of these money talk show hosts have told us that the number one call-in question that they get is, how do I get my spouse on the same page? And it's usually a money person, right? Who's usually tends to be more the saver oriented, very structured, planning oriented, etc.
Probably the one who pays the bills too.
Could be.
And could be, maybe not, but could be. But it's usually that person saying, how do I get my spouse to agree with me? Basically, that's what they're saying. And the reality is, if you're listening to this, no matter which direction you're coming from, and that's what you're thinking, you're not going to make progress because you're not honoring that your spouse has a legitimate point of view around this. Can I give an example? Because I think that might help. Is that okay? So this actually happened when we released the book. COVID hit 10 days later. The shutdown. Now, this is just a little free consulting. Don't work on a $120,000 research project for 3 years and then release the book 10 days before a national emergency is declared.
I will write that down.
That's a little free consulting. Yes. It's like bad business model. Okay. So, but what happened was that, like every Christian artist out there, every speaker, every author, a lot of our ministry revenue is from speaking events. Well, guess what happened, right? They all got canceled. And that happened with everybody across the globe.
Right.
And so suddenly, it's like a nervous time. Like many people listening to this who run small businesses, like a lot of people had that same sort of experience. It's nervous. And Jeff and I have been practicing, how do we talk about this stuff rather than avoiding it? And to Jeff's credit, he came to me and he said, essentially, look, I have to be honest that I'm struggling with a little resentment, because if we hadn't gone to Disney World last year with the kids, and if we hadn't gone out to eat at these various times or gone to the movies or whatever, we would have thousands more dollars in our bank account right now that we could really use now that all of this has gone away. And then to his credit, he came back.
Okay.
After saying that.
She's making it sound like I came back within 15 minutes and said, oh, by the way, I thought about this. It was more like 2 days.
It was a couple of days. Well, but to your credit, what you said is and this is the model, honestly, that I think will help a lot of people.
Sure.
Look, I realize, you know what? That's not really a fair perspective either, because when we went and took the kids to Disney World, and when you said, let's go bowling with the family on a Sunday afternoon, or let's go out to eat with some friends, you were building memories and you were creating togetherness as a family. And now we're stuck in quarantine on top of each other, and we like each other. And that's created by some of those things. Now, he said, look, I still may have a difference of opinion. Like, we could have had a free picnic in the park instead of going to eat. But the key was he was honoring what I valued, even if he disagreed. And you know what that did? It made it more like, all of a sudden, the defensiveness that usually would come up in me went away. And I was much more willing to sit and talk about, okay, now we need to embrace the austerity plan.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I was looking at all of those expenditures as a net cost. Actually. And instead, Shaunti was looking at them as a net investment in the family and in the relationship.
So there's a benefit to that expenditure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wow. That was really a huge opportunity for I told you so, where you can really.
That might have been in there somewhere. Okay. I can't quite remember. Maybe, could be possibly.
Right.
But that's an example, though, of we're human, right? Like, we have differences of opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The key, though, and this is honestly, for the people listening to this, if you can just make it take one step and say, how can I honor what my spouse values, even if I disagree? How can I verbally say, but I see what you were doing and I see where you were going with this. And I see why this is important to you. That is what lowers the defenses. And that is what enables the conversation. And that's going to enable trust and connection in your whole marriage, not just around that one incident.
That is so good. That is so good. This humility and honor, those are two very easy but very challenging words to think about in this perspective of money. I guess just to take this one layer deeper for a second, what about the couple where you have one person who has no interest in trying to navigate family finances? What would you say to that?
So the key is the next step in what we were just talking about, right? It is honoring what is it that you value, because if they have no interest, there is a reason, and you just don't know what it is. And I'll be very I'll be very transparent here. Can we tell them about the Dave Ramsey class? Do you want to go ahead? Yes. Okay. I'd rather that you tell this story.
So our church, back, this is 15 years ago, would started sponsoring or offering Dave Ramsey's Peace University. And I remember when they announced that they were going to be offering it, a curriculum at a particular start date. And I went to Shaunti and I said, this will be great. Let's sign up and do this. And she was like, oh, gosh, I'm traveling so many of
I'm going to miss
these weekends.
So many of those.
So we didn't do it. And then the next year, same thing. And then the third year, I signed up and went alone. And I did. And what ended up happening was when we were doing the research for this book, I actually realized why Shaunti didn't go with me. It wasn't exactly because
let's just say it wasn't just that I had a busy travel schedule. That was not the main reason.
The main reason was because I tend to be an all or nothing kind of guy.
Okay. Understandable.
So she's thinking if I go with him, this is going to be throwing gasoline on a fire. And he's going to think it's going to be exciting to eat nothing but Franks and beans for the next 8 to 12 months because we have a goal. And I'm thinking, I want to live life a little.
That does not sound exciting. Yes.
And I think you just helped us walk into many marriages.
Literally.
Yeah.
And that was on me.
And so that's an example of, I would not have been able to articulate it. He would not have been able to articulate it. But that was the reason why one person in our marriage had zero interest in being a part of it. Mm-hmm. And so once we actually started the research and he went, oh my goodness, like, I bet this is why, and came to me and said, is this why? And I went, yes. I would not have been able to articulate that either. But that's an example of, again, remember, it's not about the money. It's this other stuff under the surface. And if one person in the marriage, if you're listening to this and like, my spouse has no interest, there is a reason. And perhaps maybe turning the mirror on ourselves and saying, maybe I've done something that has made my spouse feel like it's not safe and I can't engage. Or it could be something like, suppose that the person who wants to do this is the spender, and the saver feels like, maybe they're a stay-at-home mom and they feel like, I have no agency, to use a buzzword. I don't have any right to tell you what to do with our money. I'd rather save it, but you're the one out there earning the money and you want to spend it all. And I feel like I don't have any ability to say anything different.
Because it's your money.
Because it's quote unquote your money. As opposed to, no, it's not you and me, it's our money, right? That is an example of, there's just dozens of those reasons that could be one of them. And it's a matter of recognizing that there is a reason that it's a one-sided thing right now.
And if we would get in the habit of asking that question, I wonder what's beneath this. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how I might be contributing.
Exactly.
We just can't go wrong if we keep asking those questions. Exactly. You spoke about how differing values are a key factor, in some of the tension around money. Sometimes fears we bring in. I think you spoke to a fear, that you had underneath, with that resistance to going to that financial peace class. But, I wonder if we might, I know your book's going to speak into that a lot, and we're going to cover great ground there when our listeners get a hold of it. But I wonder if we could switch gears a little bit. You guys are social researchers, but you are followers of Jesus. And so why do you think Jesus talked about money so often?
So one of the statements that Jesus made that most pastors have either talked about on stage or brought up with the congregation that we're familiar with is when he said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, right? And the reality that is often talked about, not always, but, often a pastor will mention tithing, for example, in connection with that statement. And sort of like it shows where your heart is, whether or not you're willing to trust God with your money and, give back 10% to his kingdom. However that's talked about, that's not an uncommon discussion. And it's true, but it's not the end of the story. And I think the reality is that Jesus, when he said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be. Money reveals the heart. Yes. It reveals whether you're trusting God. It reveals whether you're wanting to be together with your spouse, but it also steers the heart. And for example, your choice to trust God with your money and tithe, for example, it doesn't just reveal where your heart is. It also is forcing your heart into a posture of trust. It's like, I may not feel it right now, but I'm going to choose to trust God in this. And it's the same thing in our relationship with our spouse. I am, and I'll just be really transparent. One of my big temptations is to try to do money separately. Even though we have the same account, one of my temptations is to try to do stuff without Jeff knowing about it, without not like trying to be deceptive, but let's just sort of do something under the surface and just not tell him, right? Like that's a temptation.
And the funny thing is, most people would go, oh my gosh, Shaunti, that's terrible. I would never do that.
Well, okay, so here's the question. Like a lot of people are like, I don't have a problem with this. We have the same account. We talk about money. Okay. But do you ever try to pull the Amazon package off the front step before your spouse sees it? I mean, that's just another way of, that's another example, right, of that kind of like lack of oneness, so to speak, and lack of transparency. And the reality is, when you pull the package off the front step, or your spouse sees it, you are steering your heart in a direction away from oneness. And when you choose to let that package sit there, even though your spouse is going to see it and go, wait, did we just spend, $50 on whatever? That is steering your heart towards oneness and transparency and togetherness and connection. And that's, I think, one of the reasons Jesus talked about money so much, is because he knows it reveals and steers how we're made.
Wow. Again, conviction. I feel it right now.
We heard that sigh.
Listen. Yeah. This has been such a great just conversation, you all. And I guess just as we close, some listeners may want to take steps really towards unity in love and money. But just like us, they're learning how to talk about both. Maybe what's just like one simple thing that they can do to kind of get started with that?
So probably the starting point is, to me, we spent a lot of time creating a really simple 5-minute assessment that is free. We had a ministry sponsor step forward and create the whole thing for us so that we could offer it for free. And it's really simple, but like deceptively simple. Like, it'll really help you get started. So if you go to, you probably have it in your podcast notes, but if you go to thriveandloveandmoney.com, that's where people can get the really, really simple starting point. And they'll get a little report of like, okay, here's the way you answered the questions, and here's some things you need to know about how this is working. And if your spouse does the same thing, it gives you something really to talk about in a very kind of safe way.
Awesome. Jeff, Shaunti, this has been an incredible conversation. And I just want to thank you two from the bottom of our heart at TwoGether and Ada Bible Church. This has been something that I think every single marriage needs to listen to. And with it, it has been also very personally impactful for myself and my wife. So thank you.
Appreciate
that. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, great spending time with you.
Thank you. Well, listeners, you've heard it. You've heard Jeff and Shaunti Feldhahn, and their book, again, is called Thriving in Love and Money. And you can get that on various spaces. And you can also get the link to that on our show notes, which are located at the bottom of our podcast. If you have ever thought about having this conversation and you need to talk to a counselor, or you need to talk to a pastor, or get started about it, and it's a space where it's challenging or difficult, feel free to reach out to us at care@adabible.org to get that conversation started. But also, we want to make sure that you get that book. And if you maybe don't have the means to get it, again, reach out to us at our email and or comment on our social media channels and pages to get those things going, so we can get some great conversations going about love and money. Because remember, they said it's not just about the money, it's about what's going on in your marriage and in love. So for TwoGether, this is our season opener. We are excited to have you come back and listen with us again. For myself and Rachel, and of course, Dr. Kelly Bonnywell, this has been TwoGether.
Thanks for listening to TwoGether. We hope you've learned a thing or two. If you find the podcast helpful, please go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your listening platform, leave a comment, and give us a 5-star rating. If you'd like more information on Ada Bible Church and its ministries, or someone to pray or dialogue with about your marriage, go online and check out our website at adabible.org.